thank you so much for staying with us. Let's talk about Jane Doe number 2, if we can, please. We heard a little clip of her just now. So far, I think everyone watching this trial closely is in agreement. She has been the most compelling witness for the state. What do you think the defense team needs to do to overcome, if you will, that testimony and especially the identification of Kellen Winslow II as her rapist?
No question, that's going to be a tough one for the defense. I agree. To this point, she has been the most damaging witness to the defense. I mean, what can they do? They didn't really have a whole lot of information with which to impeach her. Mark Carlos, I remember he asked her an open-ended question at one point that somewhat backfired, but when you don't have much ammunition, sometimes you have to ask those risky questions. It's like being in a football game where your offense just can't get any yards, then you have this trick play that you've never ran, and the play can either pay big dividends or backfire, and then you use it and you end up fumbling, and that's what happens. So in any event, you just have to roll. You just have to roll with those punches and move on, and that's what the defense is going to do. And you know, if I was them, I would just stay away from Jane Doe number 2 as much as possible, because they really didn't have much information to do any damage to her testimony, and so be it. You just have to move on and now focus on the remaining alleged victims.
Sure. Tom, do you think with either Jane Doe number 1 or Jane Doe number 2, we may potentially see a consent defense?
Well, I think that's what they're obviously that's what they're leading to. They haven't, well, the defense hasn't put on their case, but just the way the questions have been formulated on cross-examine, so on and so forth, it's one of two. It's either consent or it's a misidentification. Jane Doe number 1 had difficulty with identification, as did Jane Doe number 3, but Jane Doe number 2 didn't have any issues with identifying him as the perpetrator.
Right, right. And that identification is huge. We know that. We know there were difficulties with Jane Doe number 1 identifying him. We know that Jane Doe number 3 did not identify him, but Jane Doe number 2 has. I'm curious, knowing what you know, you told us before the break that you've practiced with Mark Carlos and Brian Watkins. You know them and to be very reputable criminal defense attorneys in the San Diego area. And certainly you know, practicing criminal defense, that it's a decision you discuss with your client, a very serious decision, whether or not they choose to take the stand. Of course, it's their right not to, and not to put on any defense. The burden stays with the prosecution. But what conversations, if you had to guess, do you think they may be having, knowing what you know about them and Kellen Winslow II, as to whether his testimony may help his case?
Well, that would call for a lot of speculation on my part. But, you know, one of the interesting things about cases like this, or any trial for that matter, is you can go into it with, I'll use the football analogy again, you can go into it with a certain game plan, but that game plan can be quickly derailed in many ways by witnesses testifying in a certain way you didn't expect, with rulings that the judge may make. And here we have a perfect example of it late yesterday. We have this surprise witness coming into play.
Right.
So it's really difficult to predict what they're talking about right now. I think what they're doing is they're just absorbing all the testimony like a sponge. After court at the end of the day, they're regrouping. They're getting in a huddle and they're talking about what plan of attack, because the defense, his game plan can be one that's in motion constantly. And that's actually a smart way to handle it, because once again, you never know what can happen during a trial.
Of course, Tom, absolutely right. You have to know how to bob and weave when you're a trial attorney. Let's say you were the one representing Kellen Winslow II. Do you think that his testimony could be helpful to him?
Well, I've said this before. I mean, as a general rule, most defense attorneys try to keep their client off the stand, but that's not true in every case. Some things have to be explained away, and the only person that can do that is the defendant themselves. And I know juries, you know, from speaking with dozens of juries over the years, they like hearing from a defendant. They want to hear from the defendant. And I think the way this case is going, the defense may have no choice, because Jane Doe number 2 is a problem. And I think the only one that's going to be able to counteract her testimony is Kellen Winslow himself.
Tom Matthews, criminal defense attorney, we appreciate you sharing your insight with us. Stay there, stay put, please. We want to come back to you after we take a break. And also after the break, I want to tell you that Court TV